Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, January 9th, 2024 Radnor Township School District Policy Committee meeting. I'd like to just introduce our new committee members, Ms. Lon Rosenblum, and is it Doctor? No, Ms. Janie Lau, and who will be serving as vice chair, and Dr. Babson, who is joining the committee. I think you've served on it before.
Yes.
Great. We do not have our student rep or our teacher representative here tonight, so we'll introduce them next month. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Scott Hand for any administrative comments. Dr. Hand?
Thank you, and welcome to our first committee meeting of the 2024 calendar year. I would also like to welcome our new members, Ms. Janie Lau and Ms. Lon Rosenblum, as well as Dr. Babson as well, who has been a member of our board but is new to our policy committee, so thank you all for joining us. Our new student representative, Mira, cannot be with us tonight, nor can our teacher representative, Ms. Jenny Peterson, but both will be with us again in February. For tonight's agenda, we'll start with a discussion item prior to our action item, so a little bit different order tonight. The discussion item will be a preview of the homework policy and the work of the homework committee prior to our committee's first formal read of that policy in February. We will also have 3 second reads of policies from our 900 series, followed by a first read of policy 916 on visitors, should time allow, else 916 can come before the committee in February.
Thank you, Dr. Hand. And I just would like to ask if there's any public comment in the audience. And do we have any recorded public comment, Dr. Hand? Okay, so seeing none, we will just have a quick review of the minutes. The committee, although these are not the members of the committee that met in November at the November Policy Committee meeting, I did review the minutes. They looked fine and sufficient. I don't know if any of you have comments for the minutes. Okay, so we will presume that they are fine as uploaded, and we are going to move right into our first agenda item, which is a discussion on policy number 130, homework. So, Dr. Hand, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you. Tonight, we wanted to provide some background information on the work of the homework committee and preview the policy prior to our first formal read in February. I want to invite Dr. Jim Kearney and Dr. Dave Weidlich to join us for this discussion. Doctors Kearney and Weidlich have helped to lead and spearhead the work of the homework committee as one of our district goals, both last year and leading into this school year. Part of that committee work was to review this policy as well. There's much we've learned since the last time this policy was reviewed in 2018, including our adjusting our school start times at the high school level and living through a global pandemic, both asking us to reflect and reevaluate on what we know about time and our practices in social emotional well-being. The homework committee has done much of the heavy lift for us on this committee in research, reflection, and crafting draft policy language for us to review today in alignment with board governance. And we have a short presentation to help share some of that background. And I will get started with that and allow Drs. Kearney and Weidlich to jump in to share some more about that as well. So some general background of the homework committee. It's always nice to know where we've been, and it's been a fairly long process. It's been about a 1.5 year process that started last school year in the 22-23 school year. We had committee members that ranged from teachers to administrators to community members to parents to board members as well, and teacher association representation. The goal of this homework committee was to basically review the homework policy, to take a look at it again. And it had already been looked at in 2013-2014 school year as well as the 19-20 school year. So it's coming back around again because it's a good policy to look at and review with some regularity. I'd like to also highlight to not only our committee members but to those in the public as well that a lot of the details for this homework committee can be found on our district website at rtsd.org under district initiatives and under homework. You can see all of the committee members, each of the meetings that were held by the committee, the work that had been done in those meetings, as well as the slide presentations and even some presentations from the board curriculum committee that Drs. Kearney and Weidlich had done as well. So the work that they had done, just sharing a general timeline, they were able to get this committee together starting in February of 2023 to basically look at where the current state of our homework and basically starting with research. What does the current literature say and the academic research say about homework? So starting with that study, then going into taking a look at the actual homework policy and the administrative regulation. They were able to deliver a survey that went to teachers, students, and parents, and that committee was able to come back and actually parse through that data as well, and then begin to interpret that data and say, how would we like to apply that to policy? The committee had also looked at policies from several other districts, which I'll share in a coming slide, and then begin to draft some of that language and provide some general feedback of things they'd like to see continue, things they'd like to see change, and per those recommendations, Drs. Kearney and Weidlich had made a draft proposal of that policy, and then actually brought that back to the committee again, where they reconvened this past December to actually look at the draft language that we see before us tonight. So in general timelines as well, beyond that committee, we were able to bring this policy, this draft policy, to the administrative team and to teachers as well, teachers at large, giving them some opportunity for feedback sessions. Dr. Kearney had hosted some feedback sessions to give an opportunity for folks to have a much broader review of that and provide some of their feedback as well, which brings us to where we are tonight, bringing that before this policy committee and that draft. And then post this implementation, once the committee and a full board at a regular meeting approves the updates to that policy, it does leave time in the spring as well for any professional development. So any changes that would take place from this policy would be enacted in the 24-25 school year. So though the board might adopt the new policy this year, any changes would allow time for professional development, but changes would not go into practice until the 24-25 school year. So broadly, and before I turn it over to our colleagues and friends who join us tonight, is some of the other policies that we have taken a look at. Sometimes it's good to see what our counterparts are doing as well. So the committee did take a look at policies from several other districts. Some districts most districts have policies, not all do. Some have administrative regulations, again, not all do as well. Some policies are shorter, some policies are longer. So finding some of the language that we wanted to mirror and some things that we knew were specific to Radnor Township School District we wanted to include. And you can see on the screen here or on the live stream screen some of the other districts that we had taken a look at to compare against. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kearney, who can talk about some of the major themes the committee wanted to see us continue.
Dr. Hand, quickly, and welcome, gentlemen. Just to, so we're not going to delve into the policy itself tonight. We'll hear their presentation, and then, if we have any questions about how the process went. But we'll take up the policy itself at a future meeting, just to set that's the intention. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us. So the next 3 slides highlight some of the recommendations that came out of the homework study and the work with the committee there. We're not going to take these one by one, but overall, there were aspects of the existing homework policy, the current homework policy, and AR that the committee felt were worth preserving, and even with some revisions, thought were important parts. Among those were delineating the expectations by the different roles, parents, students, teachers. Also, an emphasis from the committee from the beginning and the board's initiative to look into homework fell under wellness. So making sure that homework does not interfere with the health and wellness of students, and that the non-instructional days were preserved for restorative purposes, so that additional homework would not be given over weekends or district holidays. Stating that teachers need to ensure that homework is meaningful, that it's important and useful was a theme that continued to come up with the work of the group, as well as something that's in our current policy in AR. Reinforce the expectations that students receive feedback on homework, which is currently part of our policy in AR. Stating that homework in higher level courses might reflect and should reflect greater depth and complexity, just not just quantity compared to grade level courses. At the same time, there were a number of revisions that the committee felt should be made to the homework policy and AR. Among those are trying to help ensure that the language of the policy was a bit more concise and a bit more clear in those areas where it was unclear perhaps to some teachers or committee members. Trying to make sure that whatever we're putting in our policy does align with best practices as we understand them. and that that there are limits on the amount of homework that students are given there. So change in language to clarify that homework guidelines shall not exceed, where there may have been some misinterpretation in the past that people felt like the guidelines were requirements for homework. The committee had an emphasis on trying to limit and rein in the amount of homework that students were given to some extent. Stating that teachers of the same grade level or the same course at the secondary level have consistent homework expectations, and that teachers and students' experiences didn't vary widely depending on who they may have. And also that teachers are communicating the purpose of homework and the expectations of homework both with parents and their students, so that there's greater understanding of what is happening with homework assignments and why they're being given. So those are some of the themes that came out of there. Dr. Wadlin's going to address a few of the others.
Sure. So in terms of another thing that came out was that of professional practice. So most specifically, the work of the committee suggests that teachers receive professional development about the policy in and of itself, as well as best practices, and that homework expectations are identified in writing in the Radnor Middle School and the RHS program of studies. Something else that came out of the study was that teachers should communicate the purpose of homework with parents and students and be flexible with students who have multiple tests, major assignments on the same day or within the same time span. Moreover, it suggests that we need to be cognizant of assigning homework to students during finals, midterms, standardized assessment timeframes, and so on. Additionally, teachers should regularly solicit feedback from students about their experiences with work, and students should be able to communicate their experiences with homework to their teachers. Student feedback is a major component of this part. And lastly, we should program to teach study skills to increase use of time efficiently and effectively within our academic levels. So that was the overarching components of that the theme of professional practice.
We can turn it over to the committee for any discussion.
So I want to just toss it out to committee members if Dr. Babson, Ms. Rosenblum, or Ms. Lau have any questions, thoughts about the process and everything. Looks like maybe, Andrew, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I think I'll kick things off. First of all, Happy New Year, thank you. I think that it's one bullet point that I think is worth highlighting is just simply that some districts have no homework policy. And so then it stands to reason or maybe begs the question of why we do. And I think it's really good that it's obvious that there's a lot of thought that's put into this, and I think that it's quite positive. I mean, I tend to be on the side of that some homework is good, and depends on, what the purpose is of it. But I tend to land on the side of a kind of reflective or metacognitive approach. Maybe you could say just a highly intentional approach to homework. That homework that there should be a lot of reflection about it, that there should be a lot of purpose behind it. And I see that. I see that in our policy, and I see that in the administrative regulations. So I think that I just want to just make those general comments. I think going forward, I would be interested to know some thoughts on perhaps how homework might be differentiated across grade levels. Maybe you could just sort of summarize, maybe one or both of you could summarize maybe how homework might be conceptualized differently across, from the elementary to the primary to the secondary level. What might be the general purpose? What might be a difference in the general purposes of homework, let's say for K through 5 versus middle and high school? Just to kind of get the conversation going. Thanks.
Rock, paper, scissors.
So I think it is a good question. And one of the things that we highlighted when we presented to the curriculum committee last June was that, generally speaking, in the research that we found, that homework at the elementary level doesn't necessarily have a strong academic benefit for students, but there may be some benefit when it comes to communicating with parents about what's going on in the classroom, as well as preparing them and giving them some opportunity to practice study skills. So, there is difference in the research across the levels. At the secondary level, the research indicates that at middle school and even a greater level at the high school, homework does have an academic, or can at least have an academic benefit for students if it's done well. So I think those purposes in general terms might be the case. I think at the secondary level, when we look at the purposes that are identified in the draft of the homework, AR at least, some of the aspects about giving the students to practice independently starts at the elementary level, but probably becomes a little bit more purposeful at the secondary level. Similarly, previewing content and helping students to kind of build some background knowledge for themselves independently before they go deeper in the classroom is probably something we're seeing with homework at the secondary level more than at the elementary level. At the elementary level, a lot of it is communication with families. It is the opportunity for students to practice independently, but recognizing that they're going to have support at the when they come into the school, as they will at the secondary level, but probably even to a greater extent assured at the elementary level, as well as opportunities for the parents and the students to kind of engage together. We want students to be able to do the homework independently without tears and without undue stress, but we also recognize that generally speaking, not in all cases, but generally speaking, the parents are a bit more involved in the earlier grades than they might be at the later grades. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think at the secondary level, a lot of it comes back to practice, at least at the middle school, practice of knowledge or practice of skills to increase knowledge. But it's also the whole concept of really embracing that whole executive functioning piece where the kids are learning how to study and learning how to break down different pieces of information and how to, if they have a project, like how to break it down and this is due this day, this is due this day. So it's really about like quality, like really embracing the whole concept of qualities of learning, I think at the middle school specifically, and I think at the high school, homework just isn't given just for the sake of homework. There's always intent, there's always purpose behind it. And it's a true extension of the classroom, so it's not just given just for the sake of it.
Thank you. Did I just turn this into the curriculum committee? Sorry. I didn't mean to do that. But thank you. And I just want to circle back to anyone who's watching that I think, again, it shows that the level of thoughtfulness and care that this is actually being discussed in policy, that we have a policy as a district on homework, because it's such a big part of school life for kids. So, thank you.
It's funny that you mentioned the curriculum committee. I'll put a pin in that. Ms. Lau, Janie.
Thank you. First, I'd like to commend the Homework Committee on just your enormous contributions to this initiative. It's clear you've put in a lot of work and done a lot of research and put a lot of thought into this, and we as the Policy Committee will benefit enormously when the ball's in our court and we get to actually, draft and revise the policy. So thank you so much. I think generally, I also agree that it's great that we do have a policy. I think it's a great idea because I think what we're actually trying to do here is to balance two equally worthwhile goals, but that could be in conflict with one another sometimes, right? So one, it's to, promote, the use of homework, right, in learning, the proven benefits of it to reinforce learning in the classroom, but also to lay the groundwork for new learning that teachers want to do, in the future in the classroom. But I think it's really important, especially for high-achieving school districts like Radnor, for us to recognize that we also need to put in guidelines to curb against excessive use of homework. Our students are often under a lot of pressure already, and we also have a lot of great extracurricular options for our students that we want to make sure they can, take advantage of. So I think, we're trying to balance, between the benefits of homework with, being kind of overdoing it, right? And kind of, unintentionally pushing our students too far in that direction. So I think the main purpose of this policy is to try to strike that right balance. And so, not to get ahead of ourselves, but when we do get to looking at the actual text of the policy, I would like to state that active balancing much more clearly in the purpose statement so that it guides the rest of the policy and that people understand kind of like what our what our true purpose is. And it's to really balance those two interests that could at some point be competing with each other.
That's great, thank you. Lon?
My comments are going to be very, very low. But I actually had the same thought when I was going through this. I thought, is this the curriculum committee rather than policy? But what I'm hearing is, and thank you again for all of the thought and time put into this. But when I think about the study habits that you're creating here, you're also creating homework habits, right? And the executive function piece is very important, and I know that a lot of kids struggle through that through COVID. So what you're gathering right now is actually, the homework piece is an extension of their day, right? And the time that you put into the homework really is an extension of your executive function skills. So I think, as we move or as we work more towards, redefining and defining what the homework policy is, there's a lot more thought that goes into it because of what the kids have experienced through COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you. As I served on the committee, so I'm intimately and, aware of how much work the two of you put into this and the, robust conversations that we had as a part of this. Again, there's nothing I could add to the comments here except to say that we'll do the work of crafting the policy, and I appreciate your comment there in terms of the purpose. And then, to your point, Dr. Babson, the curriculum committee is really going to be, they'll take whatever the policy is and execute on this. They'll execute on it through professional development with the teachers, through, educating our parents and things like that. But I do want to say that I think this component of executive function is really important. I don't serve on curriculum, so I don't get to, go and say this in the curriculum committee, but Janie mentioned it, Lon mentioned it, you actually mentioned it, and the first thing that came to my mind was, through curriculum and through professional development, I do think that there's a lot of work that we could do to strengthen our students' executive functioning skills so that they are able to make the most of the homework that is assigned to them. If you don't know how to do homework and we just send homework home,
Right.
I'm not sure that really helps the situation. So, I do think that there'll be, and you address it in the presentation, which I really appreciate. Everybody recognizes that there will be professional development work to be done, and I do think that there will be some curriculum considerations to be made with regard to can we strengthen our, we may have to teach students how to study. And starting at a young age, really indoctrinate into them good study habits and not presume that people just know how to do homework and they just know how to study. And to your point, Lon, I think COVID showed us, in fact, we have a lot of students who are able to do that, and we have a lot of students who struggle to do that. And that became very, very, very apparent during COVID. And to all credit to the district, I think we pivoted and put a lot of structures in place to help students as much as we can, but it really did shine a light on something that, we're not going to address here, but it did come up with a few of us. So thank you so much. We look forward to seeing the draft policy and having those discussions in the future. Dr. Hand, is there anything else with this?
Yeah, we'll take some of the feedback about the purpose statement, the at least initial draft policy. We will redraft that, is online for our committee, but also for the public if they wanted to see that now prior to our first read to get sort of an extra glimpse of it.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to move into our action items on the agenda. The first one is policy. Thank you both, gentlemen. We'll see you in the future. Is policy 137, home education programs, and this is up for a second read and adoption. And just to give everyone just a refresher course, generally speaking, our second read policies, we're kind of giving a light review. Certainly if anyone has questions about them, bring them forth, but these have already had a first read and a first read vote by the board, and this is for second read and adoption the intention would be to put them on the January board meeting agenda. So the first one is Policy 137, Home Education. Dr. Hand?
So the policy revisits us tonight for a second read, and included in there, in the new reads were a revised purpose statement at the request of the committee for that initial first read. This one was also under initial discussion. Other changes were made based on our prior 2 reads of this policy. This one actually went through a couple of reads. Yes, this one, I think it's about the 4th or 5th time this policy is before us. But the policy was initially under review based on changes to school code, PSBA model policies, and adding new language to the administrative regulation, specifically for extracurricular, co-curricular, and career and technical education programs. Policy 137 does add the word homeschooling for reference. That makes it easier for the public to find when searching on board docs, and that language is also added to the administrative regulation.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about this particular policy? Janie, Andrew, Lon?
You know what?
You're going to ask you, it's a great question to ask about
Which one?
school code, the authority.
I'm not sure which one.
Who has authority over school code? Because this policy changed because of school code. And when you and I talked about who has authority over school code.
You might have to answer.
Oh,
that
that's fine,
question.
that's fine, no worries.
No, my only question was because of, and it's very different, but if you're reading this policy for the first time, is it necessary to include that this is very different from online instruction? Or virtual, or, I'm not sure what we're calling it, but is it, and I don't think that it is, but I just thought that it would be.
I mean, I think the homeschooling would be for those who are following and that we have accountability towards. So you have our cyber program, at least internally, where we have Radnor Cyber Academy, but that follows our curriculum as well. But then you'll also have external cyber charter schools, which would be outside of homeschooling. So these are specifically for folks who are within our district who are deciding to school at home and that are following state standards, and that there is accountability to that very differently than it would if they were externally enrolled in a cyber charter school.
Okay, so it's very different. It doesn't need to be addressed then.
I don't think so. I wouldn't think so.
No one had questions, but when Lon and I were talking about so this is an example of a policy that came forth because of changes to school code. And then it begged the question, I was trying to recall which body actually has authority over school code. Is it PDE, Mr. Christopho, or?
Yeah, well, there's the, what's commonly referred to as the Pennsylvania School Code, which is the
Right.
legislatively enacted statutes which deal with regulating public schools. And then the Pennsylvania Department of Education publishes regulations as a agency, which are also address the school code as well. So in this particular one, if you just look at the citations, if the, for example, if we go to the end here, you'll see that the citations, the PA code citation is to a regulation, and the other one, which is the 24 PS 1327, that's to a statute that was enacted by the legislature.
Okay, thank you, appreciate that. It was just a kind of the housekeeping question that came up. So if the committee agrees, we are going to put this forth for second read and adoption on the January agenda. Great, thank you. Dr. Hand, we're going to move right into policy 904, which is item agenda number 502, public attendance at school events, which is also up for a second read.
This policy as well is under review based on our 900 series. For this, we created administrative regulation and reorganized some of the procedural guidelines to be included within the AR rather than within policy. We also added expected behaviors, crowd control, special considerations for safe schools reporting, and based partly in PSBA's more recent model policy. Guidelines for tobacco were moved from the AR back into the policy at the request of this committee, with the added prohibition of anywhere on campus, so making sure that that was clear in there. And we further added cross-references to other policies as requested by the committee.
And again, does anyone have any questions about this policy for second read? These are two examples of policies that we actually did have them as a first read for several months. They had, and it's not uncommon to have, we might have fair amount of conversation about a policy at first read, and this was two examples. Okay, so seeing no questions, then we will also, with the consent of the committee, see this on the agenda for second read and adoption. Great, let's move right into agenda item 503, which is policy 907, school day visitors, which is also up for a second read. Dr. Hand?
Thank you. And additionally, this is under review based on our 900 series review. We did reorganize, so the general guidelines are included in the policy, so we had those listed in policy, and specific guidelines and procedures are in the administrative regulation. We did include the word day, indicating school day in the policy, so it says school day visitors to distinguish policy and procedures used during the school day. So, but overall, the policy content generally stayed the same.
Does anyone have any questions about this particular policy? Okay. So then, Dr. Hand, if there's no questions, we will also, with the consent of the committee, see this on the agenda for the second read and adoption at the end of January. And now we will move into item agenda number 504, which is policy 916, volunteers. This is for a first read. This is actually the second or third time we've had it back for a first read. It was a big policy, so why don't you delve into this?
Absolutely, and you can
Thank
see
you.
how closely related a lot of these policies are, the difference between a visitor and a volunteer, what do those look like? So this policy is under review based on our 900 series of review, and I keep mentioning that because folks will ask what brings a policy to committee, so it's part of our regular review, and you can see these are all chunked together in our 900 series. We first took a look at this at our November committee meeting, but we did this as a discussion item, similar to how we did tonight in the homework committee. So we had an opportunity to first review that as a discussion, but knew that we wanted to bring it also to a new committee who joins us tonight. So not only the last committee, but this committee could have some voice and some eyes on this as well. So we did create an administrative regulation, which was not present before, and move some of the procedural requirements and regulations into the AR. The volunteer classification terminology was changed from Tier 1 volunteer and Tier 2 volunteer, which was in the prior policy or in the current live policy. And we changed that language to direct volunteer and indirect volunteer, and we changed that from Tier 1 and Tier 2 respectively. While the definition of that has changed, the language itself has remained very similar. We also updated terminology based on PSBA's 2021 model policy, added tuberculosis in there for testing requirements and reporting, and we revised the supervision and training subsections. There's also now an anti-discrimination bullet in the volunteer context within the newly created general guidelines section.
Do you have any questions, Janie? Okay, why don't you go ahead?
So I'm just going to return to my theme of clearly stating in the purpose statement what we're trying to achieve. And I think here we're trying to balance two potentially competing interests, right? So I think first and foremost, through this policy, we're trying to ensure the safety and the security of our students and our staff, right, in terms of the people that we allow to have direct and indirect contact with them through school-related activities. And yet, I think another equally worthy goal is to try to promote a spirit of inclusiveness and to make it as easy as possible for as many volunteers, for people who desire to volunteer and give their time and effort to our school district, including our parents and other members of our community. We want to make that as easy as possible for them. And that, that begins with just the terminology. So I really appreciate the fact that you've changed the terminology from Tier 1 and Tier 2, who I think, to a lot of people, it seems kind of inscrutable. It's like, what does that even mean? And so now, you very quickly explain, why direct volunteers are subjected to a higher level of scrutiny, and you have to go through more rigorous, background checks and versus indirect volunteers, right? So I think that alone will just make this a lot easier to understand, and hopefully, it's my hope that it will encourage a lot more of our parents, who don't have a lot of time, to go through this process because, it does take a lot of time. It's very time consuming. There are a lot of steps you have to go through, but I think it's worth it if they understand exactly why they're doing it and kind of the payoff, right, of getting a lot more volunteers, I think is worth it. So I think, this initiative, this project is highly worthwhile because I think the payoff is great if it just, enables a lot more of our parents to feel like, oh, this is easier than I thought it was, or, I actually understand now why they're asking me to do take all of these steps, just so I could be a PTO volunteer or a field day volunteer or whatever it is. So I appreciate that.
Lon, do you have any questions, thoughts?
No, I would just reiterate that it's a great thing that you're distinguishing the two different volunteers rather than just lumping them all in one, to allow everyone to participate. Thank you.
Andrew?
Just quickly on this policy, I had, when I was a volunteer at Camp Canadensis last year, I was asked to fill out a medical information form that was asking some fairly detailed questions. I understood the intent of the form, but, my reply to the school nurse who requested it was, I have my insurance card, here's my emergency contact. So in other words, that generally might be, how that might be addressed within the language of either the policy or the AR is, up for discussion. But I think that pursuant to, or following up from what Janie just said, how can we sort of, make being a volunteer an inviting process and not cumbersome in any way, and for there to be a little bit more, I would say, just maybe working with parents a little better in that regard. This form is, again, the intention behind it was good. If you're going to be away, working, in a capacity to help the school community, it's good for people to know, what medical issues that you might have. On the other hand, I don't know, I told the nurse, I said, hey, this is fairly exhaustive here. So, it's just something to keep in mind.
It's actually a really great point, because I'm not sure that requirement to fill out that form is provided for anywhere in the policy. It's so,
Yes, I reviewed the policy.
Right.
Before I replied to the nurse, and I
Right.
said, I'm not trying to be difficult, but there's nothing in the policy saying that, so.
right. Back to the policy, so, I've seen it several months. I will say that one thing that's kind of hitting me tonight hitting me that I wanted to share tonight is that within the guidelines, we define direct and indirect volunteers as definitions, and then they're not utilized again in the policy guidelines themselves. And I think my suggestion would be, so what's not, and then I looked at the AR, and we only talk about what the clearance requirements are for indirect volunteers. For direct volunteers. And my memory of Tier 1 and Tier 2 is that all volunteers, whether direct or indirect, whether Tier 1 or Tier 2, there were some basic background, I thought there was some basic background information that we used to have to give to be what used to be called Tier 1, but I guess we'll now call even indirect volunteers. So can we get clarity around, if you're going to be an indirect volunteer, you don't need any background checks at all? And if you're a direct volunteer, which used to be the old Tier 1, I'm very clear on what those are, because that all came about from situation that I think it's, what is it called, the Child Protective Act, Mr. Kristoff, there's some name for it. And it really all came as a result of, unfortunately, the situation that happened with, out at Penn State. It was a very direct link to the things, but it is a little unclear to me, and maybe we don't require any background checks whatsoever to be an indirect volunteer. And maybe that was always, I guess maybe I really do need to read through that piece of it, but I did think that you don't need to, in the old requirements, Tier 2 volunteers did not need certifications. So in the guidelines, where it says, where is it saying it now? Discrimination, all volunteers are expected, volunteer service, the names of indirect. Oh, I knew it. It's number 7. I'm sorry. this is what I'm going very roundabout way of saying this. Number 7 just says volunteers, the guideline. It should say direct volunteers. Since direct volunteers are the only ones who have to comply with the background check, and since you make a point of defining direct and indirect above, but then you only refer to volunteers in number 7, it could lead an indirect volunteer to believe that they also have to do the background checks, if that makes sense. So I would suggest changing regulation number 7 to say direct volunteers must also comply with all of the requirements. And whether or not you want to say indirect volunteers do not need to, I don't have I think it would be helpful in the old policy, Tier 2 volunteers do not need certifications was spelled out. So we don't want to leave indirect volunteers with the impression that they do need to get certifications. But I for sure think that number 7 should say direct volunteers. And I don't know if you want to capitalize the word volunteer in the other guidelines and even say all indirect and direct volunteers, for instance, in number 2, all direct and indirect volunteers shall be informed of the conduct. Again, because you define them up above, or, you know, I get that you say that there's 2 classifications of volunteers. That part I feel less strong about, but I do think in number 7 you should make it clear that it's direct volunteers. And how does everybody else feel about that?
Yeah, so you're suggesting just add the word all?
No, number 7 would be to say,
Before volunteers?
no, because only direct volunteers. In number 7, according to the law and the way that we are redefining what used to be called Tier 1 and Tier 2. Number 7's regulation, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Hand and Mr. Christofko, it is direct volunteers must also comply with all of the requirements set forth in the AR. And then when you read the AR, it talks all about the direct volunteers and all the things they have to do.
Okay, so you're
my
saying
suggestion,
add direct.
add the word
Got it.
direct, yes. In that case, I would capitalize indirect volunteers in the, there's another guideline that talks about indirect volunteers because we defined it. I would capitalize it, but that's really the only comment I have about the policy. I agree with everybody. I think it's better terminology. We scrambled to put this together years ago when it came to be. And we did make it clear. Is there a provision, I don't need to see it, but is there a provision in the administrative regulations that if you are a direct volunteer for whom the certifications would pose a financial challenge, how they could go about getting assistance and getting them? We say in the policy that no one will be kept from being a volunteer because of a financial hardship. But we also do say that you have to have these background checks. If you have a hardship, do we tell them how they can maybe get some help with the finances of that?
I think we can either include, since it's administrative regulation, we can include that in there, or definitely be sure to include that on our website, which mirrors a lot of this language
Great.
with direct links, phone numbers, contact information.
I think that would be helpful to, since we say we don't want that to be a barrier, let's let them know how we can help them have it not be a barrier. Okay, so with that, are we okay with moving this forward for first read? All right, great, then let's. No, this is the first read. That's first read by the board. So it will show up on the agenda at the end of January. It'll be on the consent agenda as a policy for first read, and then it will come back to us next month, largely unchanged. It shouldn't be changed at all, actually, and then for second read. All right, great. So put that on the agenda, great. And with that, do we have any new business from the policy committee?
I do have something to share, which is not necessarily new business, but for the recording, there was an issue with the live stream, so those who are watching it online will actually be watching it afterwards, so we will upload that afterwards. So if anybody's wondering about the live stream right now, it'll be available probably tomorrow, and we'll get that uploaded and put online.
Great, okay. So if there's no new business, then I will see if there's any public comment in the room. And seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you so much, everybody.